Dad, stop wasting my money on this garbage. My son's voice exploded across the private dining room, loud enough to silence every conversation in the restaurant. Forks stopped moving. Glasses froze halfway to people's lips. Dozens of wealthy guests turned their heads toward our table. Jason stood there in his custom-made Italian suit, glaring at me as if I had committed some unforgivable crime. In his hand was the birthday gift I had brought for my grandson. His face was red with anger and embarrassment. Starting tomorrow, your allowance is cut off, he continued. No more money. No more privileges. Stay in your room and stop making me look bad. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smirked. Nobody said a word. Nobody defended me. I simply looked at my son and then at my daughter-in-law Valerie, who was trying to hide a smile behind her wine glass. What none of them knew was that the money Jason claimed belonged to him had never been his in the first place. Every dollar he spent, every luxury he enjoyed, every symbol of status he showed off to the world ultimately came from me. And by the following morning, he was about to discover exactly how wrong he had been. Before I tell you what happened next, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who loves powerful family stories, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for? Let me know because I'd love to hear your story. The celebration was taking place at the Emerald, one of the most expensive restaurants in Boston. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, reflecting golden light across marble floors and polished silverware. The room was filled with business executives, investors, politicians, and socialites who measured success by the size of their bank accounts and the brands stitched into their clothing. The occasion was my grandson Sammy's 10th birthday. Everyone important in Jason's world had been invited. I sat near the far end of the table, doing my best not to attract attention. My suit was nearly 10 years old. The elbows were worn. My shoes had been repaired more times than I could count. Compared to the luxury surrounding me, I looked completely out of place. Maybe that was exactly how Jason wanted it. Grandpa, a small voice whispered beside me. Sammy tugged gently on my sleeve. Did you bring it? His eyes were bright with excitement. I smiled immediately. Out of everyone in that room, Sammy was the only one who still looked at me with genuine love. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and carefully pulled out a cream-colored envelope. The paper had become slightly soft from being carried around all evening. My fingers trembled as I held it, not because of my age, but because of what it represented. 10 years earlier, on the day Sammy was born, I had purchased a $50 treasury bond in his name. My father had done the same for me when I was a child. I had done it for Jason when he was born. It wasn't about the amount of money. It was about teaching patience, discipline, and the understanding that real wealth takes time to grow. Happy birthday, buddy, I said quietly as I handed him the envelope. This is for your future. Sammy's smile widened. He reached forward eagerly. But before his fingers touched the envelope, another hand snatched it away. Jason. He tore it open without asking. He pulled out the bond, stared at it for a few seconds, and then laughed loudly enough for the entire room to hear. $50? He announced. Conversations stopped completely. Every eye in the restaurant seemed to be focused on us now. Seriously, Dad? $50. I remained calm. It's a treasury bond, I explained. It grows over time. It's meant to teach him the value of saving and investing. Jason rolled his eyes. The value of saving? He spread his arms dramatically. Look around you. This dinner alone costs over $10,000. That's value. That's success. Not some piece of paper worth $50. Before I could respond, he crumpled the bond into a tight ball. My stomach tightened. Jason, I said quietly. He ignored me completely. This isn't a gift, he continued. It's embarrassing. Then he tossed the bond into a silver ice bucket filled with champagne and melting ice. Several guests laughed nervously. Others pretended not to notice. Valerie leaned toward the woman sitting next to her and lowered her voice just enough to make sure I could still hear every word. You'll have to forgive him, she said. He's getting older. We let him live with us because we feel sorry for him. But honestly, he doesn't understand how the world works anymore. The woman nodded sympathetically. Valerie shrugged. At this point, he's basically another expense. A burden. The word wasn't spoken directly, but everyone heard it anyway. And everyone silently agreed. I looked around the table. Nobody challenged her. Nobody reminded them who had built the company that funded this lifestyle. Nobody mentioned the years I spent working 18-hour days so Jason could have opportunities one never had. Nobody remembered the sacrifices. To them, I was simply an old man living off his successful son. I glanced toward Sammy. The smile had disappeared from his face. He stared down at his plate, his cheeks red with embarrassment. I could tell he wanted to say something. I could tell he hated what was happening. But he was only 10 years old, and he was afraid of disappointing his parents. Slowly, I pushed my chair back from the table. The sound echoed through the room. Jason looked annoyed. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I'm tired," I replied. "I'm heading home." He waved dismissively. "Fine. Just don't expect the driver to take you. He's busy." A few people chuckled. Jason smirked. "Take the bus. It's more your style anyway." Laughter rippled around the table. Not loud enough to be obvious, but loud enough for me to hear. Loud enough for me to understand exactly what they thought of me. I picked up my coat, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, the party continued. Ahead of me, everything was about to change. Because after 5 years of excuses, 5 years of disrespect, and 5 years of convincing myself that my son would eventually remember who he was, something inside me finally broke. And before the sun rose the next morning, Jason King was going to learn a lesson he would never forget. I walked out of the Emerald alone that night. The cold Boston air hit my face the moment the restaurant doors closed behind me. For a few seconds, I simply stood there on the sidewalk, staring through the glass windows at the celebration continuing without me. Inside, champagne glasses clinked together. Laughter filled the room. My grandson's birthday party carried on as if nothing had happened. As if I had never been there at all. 20 years ago, that thought would have broken my heart. Tonight, it did something different. It cleared my mind. A black sedan pulled up to the curb beside me. The driver stepped out immediately. "Mr. King," he said, "I was told you might need a ride." I smiled slightly. "Thank you, Robert." Jason thought I depended on him for transportation. What he didn't know was that Robert had worked for me long before Jason ever knew his name. Robert opened the rear door, and I climbed inside. The warmth of the car felt comforting after the cold humiliation I had just endured. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Robert glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "You look like you've made a decision tonight." I stared out the window at the city lights. "I have." Robert nodded. He didn't ask any questions. He knew me well enough to understand that when I sounded that calm, something important was about to happen. 30 minutes later, we arrived at the estate. Technically, everyone believed it was Jason's house. That was the story he told people. That was the story he posted online. The successful entrepreneur living in a beautiful multi-million-dollar property with his family. The truth was much different. The house belonged to a trust, and that trust answered to me. Jason had no idea. I walked through the front door quietly. The house was empty except for a few staff members who were finishing their evening duties. Martha, the house manager, looked up when she saw me enter. Her expression immediately darkened. I heard what happened at the restaurant. News traveled quickly among people who paid attention. "I'm fine," I replied. She folded her arms. "No, sir. You're not." I appreciated her honesty. Most people spent years telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. Martha never did. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "Please." 10 minutes later, I sat alone in my study with a cup of coffee resting beside me. The room was quiet except for the ticking of an antique clock hanging on the wall. On the desk sat a thick leather folder. I had prepared it months earlier, but never intended to use it. At least, that had been the plan. I opened the folder and slowly reviewed its contents. Property ownership documents, trust agreements, corporate records, financial statements, legal authorizations. Every page told the same story. The life Jason believed he had built for himself had actually been protected by me for years. I wasn't poor. I wasn't dependent. I wasn't living off my son. In fact, I had spent the last 5 years pretending to be far less wealthy than I truly was. It started after my retirement. When I stepped away from the company, I wanted to know what kind of man my son had become. I wanted to know whether success had changed him. So I transferred management responsibilities and allowed him to take public credit for much of what we had built. At first, he seemed grateful. Then the gratitude faded. The recognition became entitlement. The entitlement slowly transformed into arrogance. Eventually, he stopped seeing me as the man who had given him opportunities and started seeing me as an inconvenience. A relic from the past. A problem to manage. My phone buzzed. The screen displayed Valerie's name. I let it ring. A few seconds later, another call came. Jason. I ignored that one too. Then a text message appeared. Dad, don't make tonight a bigger deal than it needs to be. You embarrassed yourself. Let's talk tomorrow. I laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because it perfectly captured how little he understood the situation. He actually believed I was the one who should apologize. Another message arrived moments later. You need to learn your place. I stared at those words for several seconds. Learn your place. For years I had paid his tuition. For years I had invested in his ideas. For years I had protected him from mistakes that would have destroyed his career. And now he was telling me to learn my place. Something inside me settled completely. There was no anger anymore. No sadness. No disappointment. Only clarity. I picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. The call connected after 2 rings. Good evening, Mr. King, a familiar voice answered. Sorry to call so late, Richard. Not a problem. Richard had been my attorney for nearly 3 decades. He had helped build every legal structure protecting my assets. I assume this isn't a social call. No, I said calmly. It's time. Silence filled the line for a moment. Are you certain? I've never been more certain. Richard exhaled slowly. Understood. We spoke for nearly an hour. By the time the conversation ended, the first pieces were already moving. Documents would be filed. Meetings would be scheduled. Instructions would be delivered. Nothing illegal. Nothing dishonest. Just the truth finally being allowed to surface. Around midnight, I stood by the study window and looked across the dark grounds surrounding the estate. Somewhere across the city, Jason was probably still celebrating with his wealthy friends. He probably thought he had won. He probably thought humiliating an old man carried no consequences. What he didn't realize was that the foundation beneath his entire life had already begun to shift. The house he slept in, the company he bragged about, the investments he claimed as his own, the reputation he used to impress people. All of it depended on agreements he had never bothered to read and relationships he never bothered to understand. Tomorrow morning, he would wake up believing it was just another day. By lunchtime, he would be confused. By evening, he would be terrified. And before the week was over, he would finally understand what happens when you mistake inherited privilege for personal achievement. The next morning began exactly the way Jason expected. He woke up in a 7-bedroom estate, drank coffee prepared by staff, checked messages from clients, and glanced through social media comments praising the lavish birthday party he had hosted the night before. To him, life was moving perfectly according to plan. The humiliation of his father was already forgotten. It had become nothing more than a brief moment of annoyance. In Jason's mind, I had deserved it. He had convinced himself of that long ago. People rarely see themselves as villains. They create stories that justify their behavior. Jason's story was simple. He believed he had built everything through hard work. He believed his success belonged entirely to him. Most importantly, he believed I was now dependent on him. Those lies had become so comfortable that he no longer questioned them. Around 9:30 that morning, he arrived at the headquarters of King Capital Group. The company occupied the top floors of a glass tower overlooking downtown Boston. Employees greeted him respectfully as he entered. Secretaries smiled. Junior executives moved out of his way. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. For the first hour, his day progressed exactly as expected. Then his assistant knocked on the office door. Mr. King. Jason barely looked up from his computer. What is it? There's someone here to see you. Tell them to schedule an appointment. Sir, they already have one. Jason frowned. Who? A representative from the board. That caught his attention immediately. Send them in. Moments later, 3 people entered the office. Jason recognized all of them. None were individuals who normally visited without notice. The expressions on their faces immediately told him something was wrong. What's going on? He asked. Nobody smiled. Nobody sat down. One of them placed a folder on his desk. Jason, we're here regarding a review of ownership documentation and executive authority. Jason laughed nervously. What review? The woman opened the folder. A legal review requested yesterday evening. Requested by who? The room became quiet. Your father. Jason stared at them. Then he laughed again. This time the sound was less confident. My father has nothing to do with company ownership. No one responded. The silence lasted long enough to make him uncomfortable. Right, he added. Finally, the woman spoke. According to the corporate records, Your father retains controlling authority through multiple trust structures established years ago. Jason blinked. That's impossible. She slid several documents across the desk. We verified everything. Jason grabbed the papers and began reading. The more pages he turned, the paler his face became. The signatures were legitimate. The legal language was clear. The documents were authentic. His hands started trembling. There must be some mistake. There isn't. Another board member spoke. We've already had outside counsel confirm it. Jason stood abruptly. No, I run this company. You manage daily operations, the woman corrected calmly. Those are not the same thing. For the first time in years, genuine fear entered Jason's eyes. At nearly the same moment, my phone rang while I sat in the study enjoying breakfast. Richard was calling. Good morning, he said. How did the first meeting go? I asked. About as expected. Meaning? Richard chuckled softly. Your son just discovered that reading legal documents is more important than posting motivational quotes online. I couldn't help smiling. I assume he wasn't happy. That's an understatement. We spoke for several minutes before ending the call. As I set the phone down, Martha entered carrying fresh coffee. Judging by that smile, she said, something interesting happened. Only the beginning. She placed the coffee on the table. Do you think he'll finally understand? I considered the question carefully. Not yet. Because people like Jason rarely change after a single setback. Arrogance doesn't disappear overnight. It fights to survive. It searches for someone else to blame. By noon, Jason had already convinced himself there was another explanation. There had to be. In his mind, this couldn't possibly be the result of his own behavior. Someone was manipulating him. Someone was creating confusion. Someone was sabotaging him. Naturally, he decided that person was me. At 1 o'clock, my phone exploded with incoming calls. Jason called 7 times in less than 20 minutes. Then Valerie called. Then both of them started sending messages. Dad, call me immediately. We need to discuss this. Another message followed. There has been some misunderstanding. Then another. Whatever this is, let's handle it like adults. I ignored every one of them. For years, whenever Jason needed something, I answered immediately. Whenever he made mistakes, I helped fix them. Whenever he faced consequences, I softened the impact. That pattern was over. Shortly before 3 o'clock, Robert entered the study. Sir. Yes. Your son is here. I looked up slowly. Already. Robert nodded. He's demanding to see you. I checked the antique clock on the wall. Less than 24 hours had passed since he told me to take the bus because it suited someone like me. Amazing how quickly respect appears when money becomes uncertain. Where is he? Front in trance. I stood and adjusted my jacket. Let him wait. Robert smiled slightly. How long? Long enough to think. 20 minutes later, Jason was still sitting alone in the reception room. The confidence he carried at the restaurant had vanished. The expensive suit was the same. The polished shoes were the same. The luxury watch was the same. But the man inside them looked very different. For the first time in years, he wasn't completely certain of his position in the world. And that uncertainty was only the beginning. Because he still hadn't discovered the truth about the house. He still didn't know about the investment accounts. He still hadn't seen the trust documents controlling most of the wealth he publicly claimed as his own. Most importantly, he still believed this was a misunderstanding that could be corrected. He had no idea that the real storm hadn't even arrived yet. When I finally entered the reception room, Jason jumped to his feet so quickly that he nearly knocked over the chair behind him. Less than 24 hours earlier, he had treated me like a burden in front of an entire room full of people. Now he looked like a man trying desperately to regain control of a situation he no longer understood. Dad, he said immediately. Thank God. I've been trying to reach you all day. I studied him for a moment before taking a seat across from him. I noticed. He forced a nervous smile. There seems to be some confusion at the company. Is there? Yes. He sat forward. The board claims you still have controlling authority over several corporate structures. They are correct. The color drained from his face. For a second, he simply stared at me. What do you mean they're correct? Exactly what I said. Jason laughed nervously. Dad, stop joking. This is serious. I'm aware. Then tell me what's happening. I folded my hands calmly. You've spent years telling people you're a self-made man. Perhaps now is a good time to learn how much of your success was actually built by someone else. His jaw tightened. I built that company. No, I replied. You managed a company that was handed to you. The words hit him harder than I expected. His expression immediately darkened. That's not fair. Fair. I leaned back in my chair. Was last night fair? Silence. Was throwing your son's birthday gift into an ice bucket fair? More silence. Was telling everyone I lived off your money fair? Jason looked away. For the first time, he seemed unable to meet my eyes. I was angry. No. You were comfortable. He frowned. What does that mean? It means you've been disrespecting me for so long that it felt normal. His shoulders stiffened. Dad, I came here to solve a problem. And that's exactly the issue. He blinked. What? You think the company review is the problem? It isn't. It's simply the consequence. The room fell quiet. Outside the large windows, sunlight stretched across the grounds of the estate. Birds moved between the trees. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet I could practically see Jason's mind racing as he tried to understand how much trouble he was actually in. What do you want? He finally asked. I smiled slightly. Interesting question. Why? Because it's the first time in years you've asked me what I want instead of telling me what I should do. Jason rubbed his forehead. Dad, please. I'm trying here. Are you? Another uncomfortable silence followed. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and immediately looked worried. I need to take this. Go ahead. He answered and stood up. Hello. I watched his expression change within seconds. Confusion became concern. Concern became alarm. What do you mean the transfer didn't go through? He asked. He began pacing. No, that's impossible. Another pause. What account? Restrictions? His voice grew louder. Fix it. Then he ended the call and stared at the phone. Something wrong? I asked. Jason swallowed hard. The bank flagged one of our corporate accounts. Interesting. This isn't funny. I didn't say it was. He looked at me suspiciously. Did you do this? Do what? The company review. The account restrictions. Everything. I requested transparency. Transparency? He snapped. My entire day has been a disaster. Your entire life has been built on assumptions. That answer clearly frustrated him. He sat down heavily and exhaled. For a moment, he looked less like a powerful executive and more like the confused young man I remembered from years ago. Then the front door opened. Valerie entered. Her heels clicked sharply across the floor as she hurried into the room. Unlike Jason, she wasn't trying to hide her panic. Richard just called, she said before even greeting me. The trust documents are real. Jason closed his eyes. Valerie turned toward me. What exactly are you doing? Having coffee, I replied. Don't play games. Then don't ask childish questions. Her face reddened instantly. We deserve answers. I laughed softly. Deserve? Valerie crossed her arms. We've worked hard for everything we have. Everything? I asked. Yes. Including this house? Neither of them answered. Including the investment portfolio? Still nothing. Including the private equity holdings? Their silence told me everything. They didn't know. They had never known. Because they had never bothered to ask where the foundations came from. They only cared about enjoying the benefits. Valerie looked at Jason. What is he talking about? Jason didn't respond. The fear in his eyes was growing stronger now. He was finally starting to realize the problem extended far beyond a few corporate documents. I stood and walked toward a cabinet on the far side of the room. Inside was another leather folder. Thicker than the first one. Much thicker. When I placed it on the coffee table, neither Jason nor Valerie spoke. What's that? Valerie asked quietly. Your reality. Jason stared at the folder. What do you mean? I opened it and slowly turned the first page toward them. The document showed the ownership structure of the estate where they lived, the estate they proudly showed off to friends and business associates, the estate Jason referred to as his home. Valerie's eyes widened immediately. Jason grabbed the document and began reading. His hands started shaking. No, he whispered. He turned another page, then another, and another. Every page revealed another truth, another layer, another piece of a life they believed belonged entirely to them. By the time he reached the final section, Jason looked physically ill. Valerie sank back into her chair, unable to speak. I remained calm. Because this wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was simply the truth. And sometimes the truth is far more devastating than punishment. Jason slowly lifted his head and looked at me. The arrogance was gone. The confidence was gone. Even the anger had disappeared. For the first time in many years, my son looked genuinely afraid. And deep down, he knew something even worse. This was only the beginning. Jason stared at the documents for what felt like an eternity. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Only 24 hours earlier, he had stood in a luxury restaurant publicly humiliating me in front of his friends, business associates, and even his own son. Now the same man sat frozen in a chair, turning pages with trembling hands as the foundation of everything he believed about his life slowly collapsed. Valerie leaned closer and grabbed one of the documents from him. Her eyes moved quickly across the page before widening in disbelief. "This can't be right," she whispered. "There has to be some mistake." I didn't answer. There was no need. The documents spoke for themselves. Every signature was valid. Every filing was legitimate. Every agreement had been carefully structured years before either of them ever thought to question where their lifestyle truly came from. Jason finally looked up. "Why would you do this?" The question almost made me laugh. "Do what? Hide all of this?" "I didn't hide anything." "Then why didn't you tell me?" I folded my hands. Calmly. "Because you never asked." Neither Jason nor Valerie had an answer for that. The truth was simple. They had spent years enjoying the rewards without ever being curious about the origins. As long as the money arrived, the investments grew, and the luxury lifestyle continued, they never felt the need to understand the structure supporting it. That was the danger of privilege. After enough time, people stop seeing it as a gift and start believing it's their birthright. Jason stood and began pacing across the room. "This is insane." "No," I replied. "What's insane is believing that everything appeared by magic." He stopped walking. "I worked hard." "You did." "I built relationships." "You did." "I grew the company." "You helped grow it." Jason clenched his jaw. "Then why does it feel like you're taking credit for everything?" For the first time, a flash of anger crossed my face. "Because you spent years pretending I deserved credit for nothing." The words hit harder than anything else I had said that day. Jason immediately looked away. Deep down, he knew I was right. For years, he had introduced me as a retired relative, a dependent parent, an old man living under his roof. Never once did he tell people the full truth. Never once did he mention who built the original business, who financed the early expansions, who personally guaranteed loans when the company was struggling, or who quietly protected him from financial disasters that could have destroyed his career. I had allowed it because I wanted him to stand on his own. Instead, he had chosen to erase the ladder that helped him climb. Valerie finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" I looked directly at her. "That depends." "Depends on what?" "On whether either of you are capable of accepting responsibility." Jason laughed bitterly. "Responsibility? You're the one creating chaos." "No, I'm ending an illusion." Before either of them could respond, my phone rang. It was Richard again. I answered immediately. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," he replied. "I thought you should know that several investors have requested clarification regarding ownership disclosures." Jason's face immediately turned pale. He could hear enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. "How many?" I asked. "Most of the major ones." That was fast. News travels quickly when money is involved. We ended the call. Jason looked terrified now. "Investors?" he asked. "What investors?" "The ones who assumed you own more than you actually do." "You can't do this." "I haven't done anything." "You know exactly what I mean." I stood and walked toward the window. "For years you've enjoyed the benefits of my silence. Now you're experiencing the consequences of transparency." Jason sank back into the chair. The confidence that once defined him had almost completely disappeared. What replaced it was something far less comfortable: uncertainty. Meanwhile, across town, conversations were already beginning. Board members were asking questions. Financial advisors were reviewing documents. Investors were discussing ownership structures they had never fully examined before. Nobody was accusing Jason of fraud. He hadn't broken any laws. But perception mattered. And the perception that he was entirely self-made was beginning to unravel. Around an hour later, another unexpected visitor arrived. Sammy. The moment I saw my grandson standing in the doorway, I smiled for the first time that day. He walked directly past his parents and hugged me tightly. "Grandpa," he said softly. "Are you okay?" I hugged him back. "I'm fine, buddy. I'm sorry about yesterday." Those 6 words hurt more than all of Jason's insults. Because a 10-year-old child had enough empathy to recognize wrongdoing while 2 adults had spent years justifying it. I gently placed my hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to apologize for something you didn't do." Sammy looked down for a moment. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled something out. It was damp and slightly wrinkled. My eyes widened. The treasury bond. I got it out of the ice bucket, he said. I didn't want it to get ruined. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Even Jason looked ashamed. Sammy carefully handed it back to me. I still want it, he said. Because you gave it to me. I felt a lump form in my throat. All the money, all the business, success, all the luxury in the world suddenly seemed insignificant compared to that simple gesture. Sammy understood something his parents had forgotten long ago. Value isn't measured by price tags. It's measured by meaning. As I looked at my grandson, I realized why I was doing all of this. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice anymore. It was about preventing another generation from learning the same arrogance that had consumed Jason. And as I glanced toward my son, I could see that he finally understood the situation was no longer about losing money. He was in danger of losing something much more important, the respect of his own child. The rest of that afternoon passed in complete silence. Nobody seemed to know what to say anymore. The arguments had stopped. The accusations had faded. Even Valerie, who always seemed to have an answer for everything, sat quietly staring at the stack of documents spread across the coffee table. Reality had finally caught up with both of them. For years, they had been living inside a carefully constructed version of the truth. Now that version was falling apart piece by piece. Sammy remained beside me, sitting on the couch and occasionally asking questions about the treasury bond. Unlike the adults in the room, he wasn't concerned about ownership structures, trusts, or investment accounts. He was curious about how $50 could grow over time. I spent nearly 30 minutes explaining compound interest, patience, and long-term thinking. He listened carefully to every word. So if I leave it alone, it'll become worth more later? He asked. Exactly, I replied. Some things become valuable because people are willing to wait. I noticed Jason listening from across the room. Whether he realized it or not, the lesson wasn't just for Sammy. It was for him too. Because years ago I had invested in my son the same way I invested in that bond. I had believed that with enough time, support, and guidance, he would become a man of character. Instead, success had matured faster than wisdom. By early evening, Jason's phone had become a source of constant anxiety. It rang every few minutes. Board members, investors, attorneys, advisors, people who normally treated him with admiration were suddenly asking uncomfortable questions. Every conversation seemed to create two new problems. Several times he stepped outside to take calls privately. Each time he returned looking more exhausted than before. Eventually Valerie stood and walked toward me. Can we talk? She asked quietly. I nodded. We moved into the library while Jason remained in the living room with Sammy. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Valerie surprised me. I owe you an apology. I studied her face carefully. This wasn't the confident, sharp-tongued woman who had mocked me at the restaurant. This was someone who looked genuinely shaken. For what? I asked. She lowered her eyes. For a lot of things. The honesty caught me off guard. Yesterday was cruel, she continued. What I said, what I allowed to happen, her voice weakened. There isn't an excuse for it. I remained silent. I think somewhere along the way, we convinced ourselves that you needed us. She laughed bitterly. Maybe because it made us feel important. There was more truth in that statement than she probably realized. Many people enjoy feeling needed. It gives them a sense of control. Over time, Jason and Valerie had become so comfortable viewing me as dependent that they stopped questioning whether it was actually true. Did you ever wonder why I never defended myself? I asked. She looked confused. What do you mean? For years, I listened to comments, insults, assumptions. Why do you think I never corrected anyone? Valerie thought for a moment before shaking her head. I don't know. Because I was waiting. For what? For character to reveal itself. She looked away immediately. The answer clearly hurt. Deep down, she understood exactly what I meant. Success doesn't create character. It reveals it. Wealth doesn't transform people into someone new. It magnifies what already exists. The conversation ended when Jason entered the library. One look at his face told me something significant had happened. Dad, he said quietly. We need to talk. We're already talking. No, I mean really talk. For the first time in years, there was no arrogance in his voice. No superiority. No entitlement. Just exhaustion. He sat down across from me and stared at the floor for several seconds. I got a call from Martin. That caught my attention. Martin Reynolds had been one of our oldest investors. He had known me for nearly 30 years. What did Martin say? Jason swallowed hard. He said he always respected you. I waited. And he said the only reason he invested with me was because he trusted your judgment. Silence filled the room. There were others too, Jason continued. A lot of others. His voice cracked slightly. I didn't know. No, I replied calmly. You didn't. The realization seemed to hit him all over again. Every relationship he believed he had built alone suddenly looked different. Many of those opportunities existed because people trusted me first. My reputation had opened doors long before Jason even realized they were there. He rubbed his face with both hands. How did I become this person? It was the first truly honest question he had asked since arriving. I leaned back and considered my answer carefully. One compromise at a time. He looked up. What does that mean? Nobody wakes up one morning and becomes arrogant. It happens gradually. A small act of entitlement. A little disrespect. A convenient lie. Then another. Then another. Jason stared silently. Eventually those choices become habits, I continued. And those habits become character. Tears appeared in Valerie's eyes. Jason looked devastated. For the first time, neither of them seemed worried about money. Neither seemed concerned about the company. They were confronting something much more painful. The possibility that they had become people they no longer respected. As evening settled over the estate, Sammy wandered into the library holding the treasury bond. Grandpa, he asked. Yes. Can I keep this safe for you tonight? I smiled. Of course. He nodded seriously. I won't let anyone throw it away again. The innocence of that statement struck everyone in the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because beneath those simple words was a truth none of us could ignore. A 10-year-old boy had protected something, valuable when the adults around him failed to recognize its worth. And in many ways, that was exactly what had happened to our family. We had spent years chasing wealth, status, and appearances while neglecting the things that actually mattered. Now the bill for those choices was finally coming due. And before this was over, every one of us would be forced to decide what was truly worth saving. That night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I remained awake in the study. The estate was unusually quiet. Normally, silence felt peaceful. Tonight, it felt heavy. The events of the past 2 days had forced everyone to confront truths they had spent years avoiding. Through the large window beside my desk, I could see lights glowing from several rooms across the house. Nobody was sleeping well. Not Jason. Not Valerie. And if I were being honest, not me either. I sat there staring at an old photograph resting on the corner of the desk. It had been taken nearly 25 years earlier. Jason was standing beside me, barely out of college, wearing a cheap suit and a smile so big it seemed impossible to contain. We were celebrating the opening of our second office. Back then, he had been hungry, grateful, determined. Every opportunity excited him. Every lesson mattered. He listened more than he spoke. He respected people regardless of their position or income. Somewhere along the way, that young man disappeared. The next morning, I was having breakfast when Martha entered carrying a sealed envelope. This arrived early, she said. I immediately recognized Richard's handwriting. Inside were several finalized documents along with a short note. Everything is ready. Your instructions can be implemented at any time. I read the note twice before placing it back inside the envelope. The decision I faced wasn't legal. It wasn't financial. It was personal. Technically, I could move forward immediately. I could remove Jason from several positions of authority. I could restructure the trusts. I could separate him from a significant portion of the lifestyle he took for granted. Everything was prepared. Everything was justified. The question was whether it would accomplish anything meaningful. A few minutes later, Jason entered the dining room. He looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. His shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. For years he had walked with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled everything around him. Now he looked like someone carrying a weight he didn't know how to put down. Morning, he said quietly. Morning. He sat across from me. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, he broke the silence. I didn't sleep. I can tell. He nodded slowly. I kept thinking about something. I waited. Last night, when Sammy apologized to you, his voice grew softer. I realized he acts more like the person I used to be than the person I've become. That admission took courage. More courage than anything he'd said so far. Do you know what scares me most? He continued. Losing the company? I asked. He shook his head. No, the house. Another shake of the head. The money. No, his eyes met mine. The possibility that my son grows up remembering me the way I've treated you. The room fell silent. There it was. The realization I'd been waiting for. Not fear of financial loss. Not fear of embarrassment. Fear of becoming an example of failure in his own child's eyes. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed through the hallway. Sammy entered carrying a small notebook. "Grandpa," he said excitedly, "can I show you something?" "Of course." He opened the notebook and handed it to me. On the first page was a list written in careful handwriting. Things that matter. Underneath were several items. Family, honesty, respect, keeping promises, helping people, learning. I smiled immediately. This is impressive. Sammy grinned. My teacher says people should decide what's important before life decides for them. Jason looked down at the table. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was a 10-year-old child identifying priorities that many adults spend their entire lives chasing without ever finding. "What's this one?" I asked, pointing to the final item. Sammy smiled. "Remembering where you came from." For a second, nobody moved. Jason closed his eyes. Valerie, who had just entered the room, quietly sat down without speaking. The words hung in the air like a message directed at every adult present. Later that afternoon, another important meeting took place. Richard arrived with several documents and updates regarding the ongoing reviews. Jason sat beside me during the discussion, listening carefully as financial structures, ownership agreements, and governance policies were explained in detail. A week earlier, he would have interrupted repeatedly. He would have argued. He would have assumed he already knew everything. Now he simply listened. When the meeting ended, Richard gathered his papers and prepared to leave. Before he reached the door, Jason stopped him. "Richard." "Yes." "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Jason hesitated. "How long have you known?" Richard looked confused. "Known what?" "That my father still controlled all of this." Richard smiled slightly. "Longer than you've been running the company." Jason stared at the floor. "And nobody told me." Richard's expression softened. "Many people tried." That answer seemed to hit him hard. Because it was true. Over the years, countless people had offered advice, warnings, perspective. But arrogance has a way of filtering information. People hear only what supports the story they already believe. Once Richard left, Jason remained standing near the window. "Dad." "Yes." "If you decide to take everything away," he paused. "I understand." I looked at him carefully. "Do you?" He nodded. "I think I'm starting to." For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I saw genuine humility in his eyes. Not performance. Not strategy. Not fear. Humility. The kind that comes only after someone has been forced to confront themselves honestly. And as I sat there watching my son struggle through that process, I realized something important. The biggest victory wasn't watching him lose power. It was watching him finally recognize how dangerous power becomes when it's disconnected from gratitude. But the hardest conversation was still ahead of us. Because understanding a mistake and repairing it are two very different things. And before this story was over, Jason would have to face the people he hurt most. The conversation I had been expecting for years finally happened 3 days later. Not in a boardroom. Not in a lawyer's office. Not during some dramatic confrontation surrounded by documents and financial records. It happened at the dining room table on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. Sometimes the most important moments in life arrive without ceremony. They arrive quietly, leaving nowhere to hide. The entire family was present. Sammy sat beside me, working on a school project. Valerie was helping prepare lunch. Jason stood near the window staring out at the grounds, gathering the courage to say something he should have said long ago. The tension in the room was obvious. Everyone could feel it. Finally, he turned around. "Dad." I looked up. "Yes." He swallowed hard. "I owe you an apology." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. "A real apology," he continued. "Not because of the company. Not because of the money. Not because I'm afraid of losing anything." His voice shook slightly. "Because I've spent years treating you like you didn't matter." The room became completely silent. "I kept telling myself I earned everything on my own," he said. "I told that story so many times that eventually I believed it." He laughed bitterly. "The truth is, I built my identity around being self-made because it sounded impressive." Valerie quietly sat down beside him. Jason looked directly at me. "But every opportunity one had started with you." He paused. "Every single one." I didn't say anything. This wasn't my moment. It was his. When people complimented me, I accepted the credit. When they praised the company, I accepted the credit. When they admired our success, I accepted the credit. His eyes lowered, and little by little, I stopped mentioning your name. I could hear genuine regret in his voice. Not the regret of someone facing consequences. The regret of someone finally seeing the damage they caused. Then it got worse, he continued. I started seeing your kindness as weakness. Valerie wiped a tear from her eye. Your patience became something I took advantage of. Your generosity became something I expected. He shook his head slowly. And eventually I treated you like you were lucky to be part of my life instead of remembering that I was lucky to be part of yours. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Sammy looked up from his project. Dad. Jason turned toward him. Yeah, buddy. Why didn't you just say thank you? The simplicity of the question hit all of us. Jason stared at his son before letting out a short laugh mixed with sadness. That's actually a very good question. Sammy shrugged. Grandpa always says thank you. The room fell silent again. Children have a remarkable ability to expose complicated problems with simple truths. All the legal documents, financial structures, and corporate reviews suddenly seemed insignificant compared to that one observation. Gratitude. Something so simple. Something so powerful. Something my son had gradually forgotten. Later that evening, Jason asked if we could take a walk together. We wandered through the gardens behind the estate as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees. The air was cool, and for the first time in years, our conversation felt honest. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. Why didn't you stop me sooner? I smiled slightly. You think I should have? Maybe. I considered the question carefully. There are some lessons people can't be taught. They have to experience them. He nodded slowly. And this was one of them. Yes. We continued walking. Were you really going to take everything away? He finally asked. I looked at him. What do you think? Jason thought for several seconds. A week ago, I would have said yes. And now? Now I think you wanted me to understand what I was becoming. I smiled. You're getting smarter. He laughed softly. A little late, maybe. Better late than never. We stopped near a small pond at the edge of the property. The water reflected the fading colors of the evening sky. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Jason surprised me again. I've been thinking about Sammy. What about him? He's watching everything. I nodded. Children always are. Jason stared at the water. If I continued down the path I was on, eventually he'd become just like me. Possibly. And that's the last thing I want. There it was again. The realization that mattered most. Not money. Not reputation. Legacy. The values passed from one generation to the next. For years, Jason had focused on building wealth for his son. Now he was finally starting to understand that character mattered far more than inheritance. When we returned to the house, Valerie was waiting for us. She looked nervous. I have something too, she said. Jason glanced at her. What is it? She took a deep breath. I'm resigning from 3 of the charity boards. Both of us looked surprised. Why? I asked. Tears filled her eyes. Because I've spent years pretending to help people while failing to show basic kindness to someone in my own family. Nobody responded immediately. I don't want to be that person anymore, she whispered. For the first time since all of this began, I believed her. Real change is rare because it requires honesty. Not honesty about other people. Honesty about yourself. And for the first time, both Jason and Valerie were finally facing that challenge. As the evening ended, Sammy ran into the room holding the treasury bond. Grandpa, he shouted. I put it somewhere safe. I laughed. Good. And I'm not touching it for years. Excellent idea. He grinned proudly. Because some things are worth waiting for. I looked at my grandson and smiled. He had no idea how much wisdom was hidden inside those words. Because the same thing was true for people. Sometimes growth takes time. Sometimes lessons take years. Sometimes families break before they heal. But every now and then, if you're patient enough, the people you love eventually find their way back to who they were meant to be. And for the first time in a very long time, I started to believe that maybe my son still could. Several months passed after that difficult week, and life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Not a perfect rhythm. Not an effortless one. Real healing never works that way. Trust takes much longer to rebuild than it does to destroy. But for the first time in years, our family was moving in the right direction. The changes didn't happen through grand speeches or dramatic promises. They happened through small decisions, repeated consistently over time. Jason started showing up differently. He called instead of texting. He listened instead of interrupting. He asked questions instead of assuming he already knew the answers. Most importantly, he stopped worrying so much about how successful he appeared and started focusing on who he was becoming. At the company, employees noticed the difference almost immediately. Meetings became less about proving authority and more about solving problems. Junior staff members who once felt ignored suddenly found their opinions welcomed. Longtime employees who had quietly endured Jason's arrogance began speaking up again. Respect, it turned out, was returning to the organization one conversation at a time. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after the birthday incident, I received an invitation from Jason asking me to attend a company event. Normally, I would have expected some elaborate presentation or public relations exercise. Instead, when I arrived, I found something much simpler. The entire leadership team was gathered in the conference room. Jason stood at the front. "Before we begin," he said, "there's someone I'd like everyone to properly recognize." He looked directly at me. Then he spent the next 10 minutes telling the truth. Not a polished version. Not a carefully edited version. The truth. He explained how the company had started. He acknowledged the sacrifices that had been made before he ever entered the business. He spoke about the risks, the failures, the long nights, and the people who had built the foundation he inherited. By the time he finished, the room was completely silent. Then everyone stood and applauded. I won't pretend that applause fixed everything. It didn't. But it meant something. Not because I needed recognition. Because Jason had finally learned how to give it. Later that year, another birthday arrived. Sammy turned 11. Once again, the family gathered together to celebrate. But this time the atmosphere felt completely different. There were fewer luxury decorations. Fewer attempts to impress strangers. Fewer people who barely knew the family. Instead, the celebration focused on the people who actually mattered. Friends, relatives, neighbors. The party wasn't nearly as expensive as the previous year's event. Somehow, it felt far more valuable. During dinner, Sammy stood up unexpectedly and tapped his glass with a spoon. "Can I say something?" Everyone laughed and encouraged him. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a familiar cream-colored envelope. The same treasury bond. The room immediately recognized it. "Grandpa gave this to me last year," he said proudly. At first, I thought it was just money. He looked at me and smiled. But now I know it's really a lesson. Jason lowered his eyes and smiled as well. Sammy continued. "It's about being patient, being grateful, and remembering that important things take time." The room erupted in applause. I glanced at Jason and noticed tears forming in his eyes. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't trying to hide them. For once, he simply allowed himself to feel what he felt. After dinner, he approached me privately. "You know," he said, "for years I thought success meant having people admire me. I waited. Now I think success is having people trust me." I smiled. "That's a much better definition." He nodded. "I wish I'd learned it sooner." Most people never learn it at all. We stood together watching Sammy run across the lawn with his friends. The sunset painted the sky with shades of orange and gold. It reminded me of something my own father once told me. Wealth can be lost and rebuilt. Businesses can fail and recover. Reputations can rise and fall. But character is different. Character is what remains when everything else is stripped away. For a long time, Jason built his life around things that could disappear. Money, status, recognition. It took a painful lesson to help him discover what truly mattered. The greatest surprise wasn't that he changed. The greatest surprise was that he wanted to. A few weeks later, Richard visited the estate for one final meeting regarding the trusts and corporate structures. When the paperwork was finished, he smiled and asked, "Do you regret any of it?" I thought about that question carefully. The humiliation, the betrayal, the difficult conversations, the fear, the uncertainty, the long road back toward respect. "No," I finally answered. "Not anymore." Richard nodded knowingly. "Because it worked?" I looked out the window toward the garden where Sammy was playing. Because it revealed the truth. Sometimes people imagine justice as punishment. They imagine winners and losers. They imagine revenge. But life rarely works that way. The most meaningful form of justice isn't watching someone suffer. It's watching someone finally understand. That was the real victory. Not the documents. Not the money. Not the control. Understanding. Years from now, nobody will remember the ownership structures or the legal reviews. Nobody will remember who controlled which account or who signed which document. What they'll remember is a family that nearly lost itself and somehow found its way back. They'll remember a father who refused to stop loving his son even when that son forgot how to show respect. They'll remember a grandson wise enough to recognize value where others saw only price. And they'll remember that a crumpled $50 bond rescued from an ice bucket ended up teaching lessons worth far more than money could ever buy. As for me, I still keep that original photograph on my desk, the one showing a young Jason standing beside me years ago. Only now, when I look at it, I don't see the son I lost. I see the son who found his way home. And in the end, that was worth more than every dollar in the world.